So, is this a ghost story? Yeah, sort of. Come to think of it, history is an innumerable amount of ghost stories, depending on how you define the word ghost. I didn't realize until I was finished that I was telling a ghost story, but it was dying to be told. I'll start with Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, the telephone guy. He and his wife traveled by steamboat from the United States for 14 days to exhume a body. They arrived in Italy on Christmas Day in 1903 and made their way to Genoa by train. It had been raining for days, and icy cold winds whipped around them as the 56-year-old scientist told officials he was in Italy as a representative of President Theodore Roosevelt and bribed his way through issues when a distant relative opposed the removal of the body. With all the necessary permits in hand, on New Year's Eve, during the continuing winter storm, Bell and his company proceeded to the gravesite, having passed a tall marble column dedicated to Christopher Columbus. At the top of the tiny, twisting road of San Benito Hill, above the port, with a view of the lighthouse which had symbolized Genoa since the Middle Ages, lay the remains of a minor British scientist who had died 75 years prior. So, whose grave is this? To answer this, we must rewind back to 1765, Paris, France, where Elizabeth Hungerford Keep Macy, a wealthy widow and cousin of the Duchess of Northumberland, had come to hide the birth of her illegitimate son, James Louis Macy, away from the prying eyes of royal society. As a child, James is unable to be recognized or take the name of his father, who is, scandalously, the Duke of Northumberland. He was wealthy, however, and attended Pembroke College in Oxford, where he studied chemistry and mineralogy. His research was eclectic, ranging from the improvement of coffee and tea making to the chemistry of snake venom and human tears. One account said that he carried around a case in which to trap one's tear as it fell. I don't know if that's true. He published 27 papers and was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of London in 1787. After his mother's death in 1801, he took his father's surname and published under the name James Smithson. He lived a nomadic lifestyle, never marrying or having any children. In 1829, James dies and leaves his estate to his nephew, who erects the monument that Alexander Bell is bound to move 3/4 of a century later. But why? Well, it's Alexander's goal, to disinter the body of this minor English scientist and bring the remains back with him to Washington, D.C. The body lay inside a marble sarcophagus surrounded by an iron fence with the inscription, James Smithson, Royal Society. Then on the other side, this monument is erected and the ground on which it stands is purchased in perpetuity by Henry Hungerford, the deceased nephew, in token of gratitude to a generous benefactor and as tribute to departed worth. James's nephew, Henry James Hungerford, had inherited from his uncle quite the sum of money at a young age, and is described in several accounts as a dandy or a wastrel, both of which I had to look up. I'll just give you the synonyms so you can see for yourself. One article even claims he lived only for his own pleasures, which did not include women. Another claimed that the erection of his uncle's tomb was one of the most serious tasks he'd undertook. He traveled extensively throughout Europe under the assumed name of Baron de la Bretute, and only 6 years later died in a hotel in Pisa around age 27. Since Henry Hungerford, or whatever his name is, had no spouse or heirs, a previous stipulation in James Smithson's will was now set into motion. What was this previous stipulation? Smithson's will stated that if his nephew died without heirs, his wealth would pass to the United States of America to found at Washington under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. Shortly after Baron Henry's death, President Andrew Jackson was informed of this, and unsure if he had constitutional authority to accept this elaborate gift, he asked Congress to pass legislation allowing him to do so. When Congress authorized its acceptance in 1836, Jackson sent one Richard Rush, who probably rushed to England, and with help from the London House of Rothschild, secured the estate through the British court system. Having spent 2 years there, he was able to satisfy Henry's mother, who had made claim to the estate with a small annuity paid out in her lifetime, and then sold the properties that made up the bequest, which totaled $508,318.46, which equates to $16 million today. Some suggesting that due to inflation, this could be more equivalent to $220 million today. Congress spends the next 8 years arguing over what to do with the money. Eventually, they were able to come to a resolution, and in 1848, James K. Polk signed the Smithsonian Institution Act into law, and so it was officially established. The official narrative says we don't know why James Smithson chose to give his wealth to the United States, even though he had never even set foot here. Some say it was because he was denied his father's titles and legacy, so he was bitter towards Europe, or that he was inspired by the United States experiment with democracy. But stick around, because I'm going to let you know what else is going on and why I think he left his estate to Washington. Speaking of Washington, Congress entrusted the responsibility for this administration of the Smithsonian to a board of regents or trustees. To this day, this board consists of the Chief Justice of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Mayor of the City of Washington, 3 members of the U.S. Senate, 3 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and 6 citizens. Alexander Graham Bell was elected as one of these regents, a citizen of Washington, D.C. in 1898. A few years later, 1901, the institution learned that the cemetery where their benefactor was resting was going to be destroyed by the expansion of a nearby quarry. Bell advocated for 2 years that James' remains should be collected and have an honored resting place beside the institution he had founded. However, Congress was uninterested in this endeavor. Bell told his wife that his proposition had received 1 vote, and that was his own. This could be due to the fact that at the time the institution itself was already spending large sums of money annually without much return and a lack of public support. Luckily, Alexander Graham Bell was the president of the National Geographic Society, after his father-in-law, and he had made his son-in-law, Gilbert Grosvenor, the editor of the National Geographic magazine. And so the magazine was used to garner members' support to the idea of bringing Mr. Smithson's remains to Washington so that he may rest in peace. Finally, in December of 1903, the Board of Regents agreed that Bell should retrieve the remains, and so he proceeded to Italy to do just that. His wife Mabel faithfully recorded the process in the form of photographs, some of which you may have seen here. With James in a new metal casket complete with wreath made by Mabel, and draped with an American flag, the troop boarded the German steamship Princess Irene and left for New York on January 7, 1904. In the meantime, Bell's son-in-law Gilbert went above the Board of Regents and directly to President Roosevelt, who authorized a hero's welcome for them upon arrival. This included the Navy dispatch vessel, the USS Dolphin, to welcome the Irene by firing salutes and escort it to Hoboken, New Jersey, where the casket was transferred to the Dolphin for the voyage to Washington's Navy Yard. From there, a troop of the 15th Cavalry accompanied the coffin to the Regents' Room at the Smithsonian, where it was housed along with some of Smithson's personal effects until a memorial was built. The Board of Regents went as far as to ask Congress to fund the memorial. One such proposal would have been bigger than the Lincoln Memorial if it had been built. But Smithsonian had to fund it themselves, and so they turned what had been a janitor's closet into a chapel room to hold the Italian crypt you see here. James was entombed on March 6, 1905. His casket was placed into the ground underneath the marble Italian sarcophagus, where it remained until 1973, when scientists exhumed his skeleton once again out of what appears to be curiosity, and or according to the curator at the time, James Good, based on ghost sightings? Whatever their reason, they seemed unprepared for this endeavor. When the torch being used catches the silk liner on fire. In order to save the bones, workers rush to the nearest water fountain to fill their mouths and spit onto his remains. True story. In any case, he was finally put to rest again inside his chapel to continue to haunt the castle today. So, what's been haunting me about this story? The official narrative leaves out what I feel are very important details that may answer the questions that I and others keep asking. Why did James Smithson choose to write in this mysterious bequest to the United States? Why didn't Congress want to accept the money? And why did Alexander Graham Bell care so much about the remains when no one else did? One significant detail is that Alexander Graham Bell, James Smithson, Andrew Jackson, James Polk, and Theodore Roosevelt are all Freemasons. This connects the characters in our story in a different way, and I believe it helps me to better understand the why questions I've been having. However, this then brings me to more questions. Why isn't this easy information to find? Why would this be hidden information? The answer may reside in another story, which you can watch next to decide for yourself.